For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding Podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Rewilding means a return to living in reciprocity with the ecologies in which we dwell and with each other. It is a movement that critiques and rejects social hierarchies and authoritarianism as the natural state of humanity. Through contemporary anthropology, paleoanthropology, and archaeology, the rewilding philosophy pieces together how humans created and thrived in egalitarian societies for tens of thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. In one sense, it's essentially a call to anarchy, stateless societies with collective decision-making. Hierarchy at the scale of what we call the state only becomes possible through the intensification and the control of food production through the growing of annual grains. This sedentary, predictable surplus provides the material conditions for a small group of people to force a larger group of people to produce food for them. These authoritarian societies take many different shapes, from less violent and coercive to the most extreme forms of control and domination, so abhorrent that we recognize some of them as so-called crimes against humanity. Through the rewilding lens, fascism can be seen as the ultimate pinnacle of the authoritarian hierarchical state of domestication to the fullest extent possible, using the most modern technologies for total and complete submission of people and nature. Fascism is the furthest, most oppositional force from our innate wildness. This means that rewilding is inherently anti-fascist. When rewilding as a buzzword for returning to a wild state hit the mainstream, mostly through diet and fitness culture, such as the so-called paleo lifestyle, it was watered down and perceived by a public that has been taught misconceptions of wildness. Projections of grunting cavemen and social Darwinism's notions of aggression and competition stand in for actual anthropology of living, thriving, egalitarian societies. This biased and incomplete picture of wildness has cast an oppressive shadow over the term rewilding, allowing in individuals who promote hate and inequality as the natural state of humans. As we have seen in the past, fascism is often a reactionary attempt by people to maintain order during a decline or societal collapse. As we enter a time of economic uncertainty, climate crises, and more, fascism is a growing and ever-present threat. To keep rewilding on course, to educate people on the collaborative mutual aid relationships that define human wildness, rewilders must actively work against fascism today and the fascist creep into our ideologies and movements. To talk with me about this growing threat is Alexander Reid Ross. Alexander is a scholar with a diverse background. He earned his PhD in the Earth Environment Society program at Portland State University. He's the editor of the book Grabbing Back, Essays Against the Global Land Grab, and authored the book on the transnational far right called Against the Fascist Creep. He's a researcher whose focus is on exposing the far right and fascist movements that exist today. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yay! Thank you for your I wanted to stand up and sing a song after your
what song
discourse there. I don't know, like maybe some kind of hymn.
Nice.
Yeah or like I don't know what would be a good song there.
Not sure. Yeah. So I have your book here in front of me, Against the Fascist Creep. And I just wanted
I told you not
plug
to do
it.
That.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We had a little conversation earlier about my anxiety and the fact that I'm a very jumpy person, and so Peter just raised up my book and actually scared me for a second.
I'm sorry. But I wanted to read a little bit, just this one little part, because I wanted to ask you really quick, to kind of get the ball rolling, what fascism is specifically, because it's thrown around a lot, and you use this in the beginning, in the introduction of your book. You talk about this, and you say allegations of fascism make for an excellent broadsword to be wielded at one's enemies, but as such, its blows usually fall upon straw men without clear, cogent, and responsible assessment of the meaning and history of fascism. The word is emptied of content, which is
Wow, it kind of sounds
awesome.
smart.
It does.
It's
and
weird.
and it makes me think, and we actually have talked about this before, like the definition of fascism, and it's challenging to sort of come together with a central theme. But one of the things that I feel like you've said, and I want to have you emphasize here, is that it's essentially like a collection of different things, like that when come together, like the sum of its parts are what we call fascism. And if I'm wrong, or if you've changed your mind, correct me on that. But how do you define fascism?
Okay, yeah. I haven't really changed my definition of fascism. I feel like the world is kind of growing into it though. Because like my my own kind of weird idiosyncratic perhaps definition of fascism relies on the new consensus definition, which is pretty much broadly shared around academia by a lot of scholars, is basically marked out the territory as paleogenetic ultranationalism. So basically a form of ultranationalism, a form of ultranationalist ideology that relies on myths of rebirth and returning to a kind of archaic model of the nation, while also integrating different tendencies that are relevant to that model. So then it becomes a sort of syncretic political cult in a way. And part of that syncretism is the melding of a futurist outlook with this kind of, in a sense, ultra hierarchical primitivism.
Totally.
And that's where I say I think I was kind of the only person to say that this sort of what they call archaeofuturism is actually intrinsic to fascism. And I don't know. I think Musk is really doing a lot to kind of accelerate that, the relevance of that definition.
Yeah, totally. So it's I'm gonna like really want to get into sort of like meat of overlaps of fascist ideology and rewilding, but I'm gonna like try my hardest to not get too far into that, because I actually want to focus an entire podcast just on like those points of contact. But it's interesting to think about the, like when I hear you saying about, like a myth of a past, traditions, blah blah blah, like it sounds not dissimilar to some of the aspects of multiple different groups, but in terms of like thinking about rewilding as one of those, right? As but it's like what traditions are being sought, I think, is or what is your perspective on the past, is where they sort of diverge, fundamentally.
Right. But, and it's all about the kind of sort of prism through which the past is represented, right? So like if you go back and you read, if we're talking fascism, proper, we're going back to Mussolini, not just sort of looking at the Nazis. People tend to define fascism around the Nazis just because as anti-fascists, the Nazis are the clearest example of everything that's wrong with fascism, in a sense. Mussolini's obviously god awful, but if you look at his writings, he's really weird he thinks he's a genius and a huge intellectual, and he's writing about Machiavelli, and he's writing about the Republic of Venice and the Republic of Florence, and he's trying to create this sort of architecture of the past that really sort of jibes with what fascism means to him, which I don't think he even really necessarily clearly understands, because he's very much kind of making it up on the fly. And so yeah, he's kind of forced to pick and choose different values and different ideas based on his historical rendering. And his biggest interest isn't just forming the ideology itself, although it becomes that. It's justifying why the fuck this dude is in power, because he's such an asshole. So history and fascism and the historicity of it is like this huge problem, because of the sort of mosaic type of character that it has. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
No, it's good. I mean, so in terms of thinking of fascism as ultra nationalism, it makes me wonder about like the scale. Like, is there such a thing as like a small scale fascist, or like, you know, can you have fascism without nation states?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so fascism has different levels, right? So there are fascists on Telegram who are like, you know, I've hung up my hammers or whatever, and I'm, you know, going back to sort of the land, right? I'm gonna just sort of plant my crops and, you know, watch trad wife porn or something like that. You know, that's their level of being a kind of a fascist localist. And there are lots of there's lots of historical examples of this. The organic food movement in England was kind of captured by Mosleyites and fascists. And the history of, I mean, you know, Robert Evans's podcast Behind the Bastards is kind of funny because he kind of shreds everything, all the innocence of the natural world of human kind of fetishization of nature and the green movement, right? Not to say that he or we should abandon ecology, right? But we should obviously be very cautious about our political decisions, because they almost always lead to disaster. So yes, there's a localist side, and then, you know, people like Dugan, who is like this sort of arch traditionalist but very rooted in the fascist movement. It's a sort of a sense of primitivism for the poor and futurism for the elites, right? For the sort of like warrior aristocracy. So in that sense, he's combining that kind of localism with this grandiose model that Putin has called the civilization state, right? So this is the idea that we've moved past the nation state, which is a sort of a walled off model, and we've moved into the civilization state, which can be, in a sense, multi-ethnic, but that is more of a combination of homogeneous territories than it is actually an integrative social structure, right? So within the context of a civilization state, you can have villages and, you know, a lack of electricity and you know, a lack of basic amenities in a ruthlessly elitist structure, and you can justify that through fascism, right? And, you know, of course, Putin doesn't espouse fascism, and there are all sorts of debates. I tend to say that he's a para-fascist, but you know, he's found a way to synthesize fascist ideas into what's been an ostensibly outward facing bureaucratic authoritarian regime in a sense. So props.
One thing that this is making me maybe even more confused. There's just like so many layers and spirals to kind of go down. It tends to make me feel overwhelmed when I get when I go down this rabbit hole. One of the things that that I think about a lot is sort of like especially in terms of like what you were saying, like localized fascism. I don't know if that was the term that you used, but like the fetishization of violence as a part of that. Like, you know, there's a particular person whose name, I don't like saying people's names because I don't like, you know, it's like no press is bad press, but there's a particular person who is sort of like one of these back to lander people. I'm sure you'll guess who I'm talking about. He has a gym that was basically, you know, he was part of a potentially like a white nationalist group, but then claimed he was rejecting the white nationalists, that he's not a white nationalist. But then also like is very much into sort of like Viking iconography or you know, re-envisioning that or bringing that back in, and also has like a fetishization of violence, which I think is interesting because you can accept that violence is a part of nature and a part of like biology without also like fetishizing it. And I feel like that there's something in those lines too, in terms of thinking about how societies function on a whole and how violence is a part of all human societies. But there's a level of like, at what point is it a fetishization? At what point is it like, you know, used for complete domination or a hierarchy or status or those kinds of things? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how like that kind of violence plays into maybe a definition of fascism versus like, you know, something like a democracy, for example, that uses the police force to enact violence to maintain order or something, right? Like where's the does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so let's go back to let's go back to fascism. So let's talk about again Mussolini, right? So Mussolini's super violent bastard. I mean, he was getting into all sorts of duels before he became a fascist. And
what?
Oh yeah, he got into at least 3 duels.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What kind of duels? Like fist fights or gun fights or what?
I don't know.
Okay.
Like I've only read the
So
collected
weird.
works, so I read like the articles. I
Mm.
think they used like dueling swords,
Okay.
which are like dull, and you can really like hurt someone with them. You know, like there are broken bones or
Oh
like
yeah.
bad bruises. But the intention is not to actually kill the other person. It's just to beat each other up. And
Yeah.
that's effectively what would happen, is that Mussolini and this other guy, they would meet, they'd beat the hell out of each other. And then, you know, I think in one case, Mussolini really hurt the guy and they had to stop. But in the other 2 cases, Mussolini got his share too. And then they just called it off because both sides were satisfied that they hurt the other person enough. Pretty stupid. And then, of course, Mussolini becomes a fascist through the process of betraying the other socialists and rallying for World War I, which he was paid to do by industrialists. Some say the French also chipped in. So obviously, militarism and violence played a pretty pivotal role in Mussolini's rise. And then after the war, you know, he develops these black shirts basically on like a kind of a radical model, right? He like has his newspaper. He starts getting other veterans involved. around the country, and he's basically like build the party, sell the newspaper in a sense. Like this model of like you know, a chapter opens up in Bologna or Padua or something like that. And is Bologna even a place? I think it is. Anyway, uh and they'll start selling the newspaper, and they'll have rallies, and they'll, you know, go beat up some socialists that they don't like or something like that. And it just grows and grows like that through intimidation, but also there's a demonstration effect where you know, you have a lot of riots and factory occupations and so on, and Mussolini's guys are strike breakers, you know, and at the same time they're trying to pitch this sort of revision of left-wing ideology that incorporates nationalism, and it sort of spirals out of control in a sense. So violence is increasingly urgent for the fascist cause because it's bringing in money, but also in these fights with the socialists, the fascists are getting messed up too. And the social, like anti-fascism in the 1920s was not, you know, a gentle affair. You know, there are lots of communists, there are lots of socialists, there are lots of anarchists who are pursuing fascists and murdering them.
Wow.
Yeah, there's murder. There's a lot of murder. And so there's a cult of like assassination, a cult of the dagger, a cult of martyrdom. All those things start to emerge within the very heart of fascism. And so, yeah, it's this kind of masculine affair. It's this sense of the sacred that starts to develop in fascist violence. And obviously this is fused with imperialism, right? So imperialism has its own, like if you read biographies of Bismarck, I mean, Bismarck is getting into all sorts of duels as well. He was very violent dude. And look at English imperialism and the ideals of adventurism and violence that develop in those circles. You know, so violence was no, and a cult of violence even was no stranger to politics in the interwar period whatsoever. And with fascism, the way that it developed made it slightly unique, and intentionally so. And that contributed to the sort of bellicosity that you saw with Ethiopia, with Mussolini believing that he could establish and spread his empire and basically create this whole, I think, transalpine. I have a little speculation that Mussolini wanted to develop an Italo-Austria empire. But that's another story. Anyway, I'm going on and on and on. But to get past the World War II, right? The neo-fascist cults, obviously in Italy, maintained that sort of ideal. And you can read their like stuff is like really gross, and they're like, you know, I wore the dagger on my belt like a protrusion from my crotch or something like that, you know, like a very sexualized, very like very kind of erotic obsession with violence. Although they did bomb people, they weren't just like, you know, we like to get into romantic violence and on a personal level, you know, they were like bombing trains and public spaces. So
wow. Are you familiar with Christopher Bain's work at all, The Hierarchy in the Forest?
No.
He's a paleoanthropologist. He passed away recently, but he has this book called Hierarchy in the Forest. It's kind of like, you know, pretty well renowned. It's 20 years old now, so there's definitely, you know, stuff that's been corrected or different theories around it. But one of the main premise of this book is what he calls reverse dominance hierarchy, which kind of goes through like, you know, primates and our closest relatives and different hierarchical structures in which they dwell, and then goes into like human evolution and how we've become, you know, egalitarian, and that contemporary hunter-gatherer societies are the most egalitarian societies, the most equal. And then kind of like theorizes how that came about. And one of the things that is notable about forager societies today, or before they were completely colonized or whatever, when they were still being studied, and even like the Hadza or whatever still exists this way, they have this thing that he calls reverse dominance hierarchy. So he has this theory that humans have such a disdain for being dominated, but we also have like a sort of an intrinsic drive to dominate, but that our hatred for being dominated is more than our desire to dominate, because we would rather just not be dominated at all than to dominate others. And so he has this theory called the reverse dominance hierarchy, where essentially you have, instead of one person controlling the masses, you have the masses controlling the one person that might be the upstart, or the one person that might try to actually like accumulate power or whatever. And so they have all of these like what he calls leveling mechanisms, which are like social structures and tools and things to like bring people down a notch if they start to think that they're going to be an authoritarian type figure, or they start trying to boss people around. And it's super interesting to, I like the theory. I don't like that he uses the word hierarchy, because I just hate the word hierarchy in that sense. But I like that idea in terms of like leveling mechanisms. And it makes me think about, that like anti-fascism in a sense could be considered a contemporary form of a leveling mechanism, right? Where you're trying to prevent this like ultimate hierarchy from forming.
I like that. This idea of sort of like pulling down the authoritarian, or the potential authoritarian, in order to preserve some form of ego or some personal dignity.
And sometimes, I mean, the
funny.
interesting thing is that it involves violence sometimes, right? Because some upstarts use violence to gain domination, and sometimes it requires violence to bring them down, like the Allied forces or something teaming up to take down the Nazis or whatever, right? Like,
right.
And so when you were talking about like the anti-fascist murdering fascists or whatever in the 20s, it's just interesting to me thinking about like the levels of extremes that are sometimes not, I don't want to say required or necessary, but like the levels of extremes that people will go to maintain a more relative sense of equality than being controlled by others.
Well, I mean, and I don't want to say that. Yes, well, yes, because the moral of the story of the 1920s is not that, oh, the anti-fascists were violent and that's why the fascists took power. That's
right.
Not correct.
Right.
The fascists were the most violent actors,
Totally.
and
Yes.
I mean, they like, if somebody was elected that they didn't like, they even would storm something like the storming of the Capitol, right? They would like rally up mobs to attack people. And at the same time, it is also true that some forces on the left shot themselves in the foot. There were bombings that were carried out by anarchists that one in particular killed a fair amount of innocent people.
Wow.
And that really turned people against.
Totally.
And led a lot of people to think that Mussolini's type of politics was necessary.
Right.
Actually, Malatesta was not involved in that, but actually bore the brunt of some of the backlash there. At any rate, the lesson isn't that anti-fascist violence caused the rise of fascism. It was a reaction to it, and
totally. Yep.
And it was not in equal measure. But yeah,
I also want to just say I'm not advocating for murdering fascists or anything. I'm not advocating for murder in the contemporary day. Just noting, that that's the thing.
Yeah,
that happened or whatever.
I think I was trying to kind of get back to was the assumption that you can't fight violence with violence.
Right.
Right. I think in part that it's very true. There's part of it that's true and alluring. And the thing that you raised is always of issue, that there's a world in which police are not neutral actors, and do, when push comes to shove, favor fascists over more anarchic left-wing forces. And we've seen it historically, time and time again. Absurd to even try to argue with that.
I mean, I think it makes me think of like sociopathy. I'm not a psychologist, but I've read a lot of books. I'm like an armchair, whatever. But it makes me think, there's like a spectrum of sociopaths, right? There's like the ones that are severely violent and end up in like maximum security prisons or are like serial killers or whatever. And then on the other end, you have like CEOs that just really like to fuck with people, and they're not as impulsive. They don't lack they can control their emotions better than the people who end up doing violent things, but they still like get off on fucking with people and having that kind of power, right? And I think about that sort of relates to like the state, where there's like, fascism is like that sociopath, the violent one that ends up in prison. And like, so-called democracy or whatever is maybe like the CEO, right? That can like hand out some benefits enough to just keep their legitimacy going, but still be, creating social stratification and hierarchy and demoralizing people.
Yeah, and sometimes hiring the insane psychopath
to
attack his competitors.
Yes, right. Yeah.
So which leads a lot of people to say that fascism is nothing more than the iron fist of the bourgeoisie that comes out of the velvet glove when the specter of revolution comes around, which there's some truth to sometimes. So you don't want to dismiss it,
right?
But there's a little bit more to the autonomy of fascism from what you might call even the state form. Like you touched on it a little bit earlier when you're talking about like nationalism and like, is fascism sort of circumscribed within the national question or what have you. And it, in a sense, bears a threat to the state form because it is, in a sense, revolutionary against liberalism.
Yes.
And liberalism, I don't want to say anything is organically grown in history or whatever, but liberalism does come from a tradition of state making. If you, like you said, democracy, if your fundamental reference point for democracy is, say, Aristotle, then you have to contend with liberalism as an outcropping of this classical tradition, which has made and remade states, and itself at one time posed a threat to the ancient regime, and tried to establish the fundamental precepts of what a state is supposed to do, which in my opinion is effectively pacification. I think that the state form itself is a form of pacification, political pacification. Like if you go back and you read, where does state form come from? The state is based on peace and quiet for its citizens. It's a promise. The state is a promise that you won't be fucked with, right?
Yep.
By me,
yeah,
or anybody who might be worse. So you have to select that master,
right.
and or you will be fucked with. That's the world, baby. That's the way the world works.
That was their legitimacy. Yeah, the myth of their legitimacy. Yeah, totally.
Right. So literally pacification, right? Peace. You know, and liberalism has come along and messed with that and said, hey, you're not doing this job, let's do it for you. And fascism does pacify, but it's, or tries to, but its model of a totalitarian state is a completely different way of trying to do that. And it's constant rallying of the people. It's not really a pacification model per se. It's more like a passion model. It's a model for summoning passions, right? And for sort of motivating them or steering them towards, like what you said earlier is relevant, right? Like this model of industrialism, this kind of model of productivity, right? Like we got to make our grains more productive. We got to make our industry more productive. We got to make our women more productive, right? Like it's a patriarchal, patriarchal productivity model that arises from this constant motivating force of a national advancement and this sense of belonging. This stems from the sense of belonging that the nationalism delivers. But where did I start? I started all this to talk about, you know, these questions of violence and the state form which fascism threatens to an extent, and how liberalism, in reaction to fascism, winds up becoming more statist, right? Because liberalism, despite, you know, liberalism's to some extent revolutionary appeal, and don't laugh because, you know, the Jacobin and all that. So despite, I think, liberalism's need to enact, if you will, a permanent revolution, to constantly go to the polls, to in a sense, this can be a peaceful revolution, or it can be a very violent one, but to reassert its legitimacy and continually justify popular engagement, that becomes institutionalist in reaction to fascism's disruption of peace and quiet, in a sense, right? So we have to contend with how police function within the model of institutionalism on which fascism has, or on which liberalism has to lean, you know, in order to try to calm things down, to turn down the temperature. And that's what we're seeing right now is, you know, the threat of fascism forcing liberalism to drop its appeal to equality due to the urgent need to reestablish peace and quiet and calm, which they're doing through the police, right? So, I mean, we also have different conditions, right? We have the rise of crime in the United States under Trump, which in my opinion was a real reaction to Trump's authoritarianism. I think people were like, fuck that crime. But,
or even giving people, like, I mean, white supremacists license to do more crime, right? Like, to hurt other people, right? So I feel like there's probably a little bit of both happening there with that kind of a leader.
I know, and I shouldn't really talk about crime because I'm not a crime guy. I'm not like an expert in crime. I'm not like I don't
Yeah,
know motivations and the
sure,
social conditions for the rise of
sure.
crime under Trump. But it's only to say that I think that Trump's own appeal to the police, was counterproductive, if you will,
Yeah,
which fascism is always
yeah. So
laughably so.
I want to change gear. I mean, this is you're shifting into where I'm wanting to go, which is like, uh, I read the newspaper regularly. I'm often on social media. I don't use Twitter much, right? I'm just like Instagram or Facebook or whatever, right? And so I don't really see a lot of now the news doesn't really report on um, fascism and the rise of fascism, and politicians don't really talk about it. I mean, you had like Biden say something during like the State of the Union address or something, and people all freak out about it. Um, then I go on Twitter, which just kind of see it, and I follow you. I follow a lot of anti-fascists on Twitter. In fact, that's kind of like I'm when the uprisings were happening over the last several years, Twitter was where I went to get up to date, immediate information about where things were happening. So I have a lot of followers, or I follow a lot of people on there for that kind of information. And I go on there and I just like start scrolling, and it's like automatic doom scrolling. I'm seeing like photographs of Nazis like all over the country, of like different types of fascist organizations wearing these ridiculous like blue polos or whatever, like training. Some people are making fun of them, some people are like scared of them, what, like, and I just, in this sense of scrolling, you get this sense that it's actually like way bigger than I realize, because I don't see it. Or is it a thing where I've just curated my feed to see these things more in this particular form of media? But it's really weird to see some of these things that are super alarming on there, like, these paramilitary training camps that aren't being reported about in like mainstream news or whatever, you know what I mean? And so how, like, I mean, this is what you do, right? Like, I mean, there was like a time where you were mapping out, you created a map, right, where it had like every act of like fascist violence in public or something along those lines, right?
Yeah, it was a map of intimidation, like
Yeah.
right-wing intimidation of left-wing protests,
So yeah,
or
seeing that
or
map,
left-wingers, really.
yeah, seeing that map, I'm like, wow, this is happening like all over the place. It's happening in my town. Like, and how many people are actually doing this? So then I start thinking, well, like, okay, but there's like millions of people, right? And each of these acts is maybe a handful of people in comparison to the huge resistance against it. But then, what is this small fraction that's coming out to do this that is actually like represented of a larger mind frame, or, a frame of mind that is potentially has the ability, even though there's this micro percentage of people in public maybe doing this stuff, what's the percentage of people that are actually into these ideas? And what's the percentage who are like, sort of on the fence, or like don't really fully grasp these things, right? Who elect somebody like a populist leader like Donald Trump, right? Like, what is the extent that we get, the few people in power who then actually have these larger decisions that can transform our society at large? I mean, I'm just thinking, like, just popped in my mind, like abortion rights. Like the majority of the country is for having a woman's right to choose, right? But like politicians and all these people that get into power take those away, even though the majority of people want the right to choose, men and women. And so, it makes me think about like the leverage points of power, and how these, even though on some level, maybe I've curated this feed, maybe the fascist threat isn't as big as I think it is, or maybe it is. Maybe it's like, this thing where people get into power, they have the ability to transform society, even though the majority of people don't want a fascist state. It becomes that way. So, like,
Huh.
what is your like temperature gauge on that? Like, there's like full on fascists, right? Like some group of that. And then there's everybody else who's like maybe going to elect a fascist leader. I don't, and then to what extent does that transform society? And how big is that threat?
Yeah. Let me get some water real quick. Hold
Cool.
on one second.
Yeah.
Ah, turned on my light too.
Nice.
Been sitting in darkness. Um, so that is all, I think, one question. Or at least I will try to answer
Cool. I
one
mean,
of those
and I guess
questions.
I'll sum it up into one question, which is how serious is the threat of fascism?
Right, but also within that, how serious is sort of the media's approach to it?
Totally.
Which I think, uh, so here's one example. Like I study the history of political violence in Italy in the 1970s. And one thing any, casual observer of current events in Italy will take note of is the fact that the heir to the fascist party is the party in power right now. And
Yeah.
they got a pretty resounding majority of the vote. Not like a clean majority, but
Totally.
against the five other significant parties.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the heir of the fascist party gain power, and what do they do when they have it? So one interesting issue there is the US press didn't remark on the Fratelli d'Italia and their rise very much until they got into power. And then there was an explosion in the popular press of editorials, see, I told you so, fascist party gaining power, this, that, and the other. For Italians, that looked quite stupid because a lot of Italians call Fratelli d'Italia, Forza Italia, and the Lega, centrodestra, they call it center right. It's a center right formula that the parties have embarked on, which we're running around saying, fascist party in power, and they just kind of shut down and say we can't take the Americans very seriously, and it was sort of remarked on with a great authority, right? That in our editorials and so on, we know what's going on here. There's a fascist party in power, which nobody really who was writing these editorials has a very extensive knowledge. So there were some that were very, very good. There were some that were very, very good. But I think that they were kind of in the minority, and what you ended up with was a lot of sort of grandstanding, which is pretty typical. But it's also sort of it's an issue with the way that we treat foreign affairs, and it's also an issue with the way that we treat the far right. We don't give them enough serious attention, and then when we have to, we use it for leverage, and leverage for personal gain, for personal branding, and for grandstanding, which often misses the point and can lead to the continuing sort of appeal of those groups, because they can make that claim that nobody understands us, and look at what they're saying about us, and it makes the other person look worse, and it makes them look innocent, and it feeds the victimization narrative that is often a big part of authoritarian movements. So I think we do need more attention on the growth of fascism. It is a huge, huge problem in the United States. You ask how many people, I mean, like, I think Trump's diehard constituency of like 30% of the population. I'm not saying 30% of the population is fascist, but I'm saying there's a real appeal of fascism to 30% of the population. And I also want to broaden the window and say, like, you kind of did this earlier when you're talking about some of the authoritarianism that lurks under liberal democracy's beautiful oriental rug. But you know, I want to broaden the lens a little bit from fascism, which is a sort of singular ideology, and talk more about the far right in general as a milieu, as an ecosystem in which fascism sometimes plays a controlling part. But I will say, and I'm kind of going off the point here a little bit, but I'm sorry about that. But the debates in the hypothetical world where Trump actually overthrows the United States democracy and installs a dictatorship over whether or not we live in a fascist dictatorship or is it a para-fascist dictatorship, would have probably killed me.
Yeah.
So as we are anti-fascist, we must also approach it maturely as a crisis within the modern state, which has many allies in the authoritarian right, in the far right, which should be taken seriously as well. And in that sort of ambit, I think 30% of the population that supported Trump, you have a lot of the population that wanted to overthrow the transfer of power and install Trump for life effectively. I mean, that's a big part of our population, and it's not going anywhere. So we have to figure out, like, what to do about that threat. I think what you're talking about, social media, kind of monitoring, that stuff helps, but I don't necessarily think it will continue. I think that it's a phase in anti-fascist strategy, which needs to adapt to problems like what do you do when a far right billionaire owns the platform and suspends anti-fascist accounts.
And then lets back in all of the fascists that were rejected.
All the fascists in. So yeah, I think anti-fascist strategy has to adapt. And it also seems that fascism, that there are different factions within fascism, right? You got evangelicals, you get reactionary Catholics, you get the weird Asatru people, etc. It seems to me for a while that reactionary Catholicism had gained a lot of ground, and in general, I think that that a sort of Christo-fascist movement with more open anti-Semitism has gained a lot of hegemony within the fascist movement. So that's something that we need to kind of incorporate into the way that we approach anti-fascism. And then again, it's just not a call for anti-Christianity, if you will. It's to intend with Christianity and elements of it, and try to negotiate on those levels. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I answered your question, but I did ramble for
it's great
amount of time.
So one of the things that comes to my mind, especially as we're kind of exploring the notion of like the rise of fascism, the threat of fascism, is like crypto-fascism and entryism, which is something that you've focused a lot on, obviously. And one of the things I think about is like this sort of in terms of the fascist creep is like the losing of ground of conversations around specific things. The like acquiescence maybe of certain topics or certain things, or even just the most basic thing, like the okay symbol, right? Like to do this or whatever, right? like at what point, in terms of the right taking things, is there like a backlash that needs to happen, like a hard backlash for every single thing that they try to take or whatever, right? Like how can I not do this anymore? Like every single, like I used to do this all the time. Oh, that's great, okay, whatever. And now when I start to do it, I'm like, oh, don't do that. Like there's this anxiety around it, right? Like and it's just so weird that there are things that are like more and more becoming off limits, because I feel like, and I think this comes down to maybe our question before of like, I think, intrinsic violence, or this notion of like, authoritarians are much more violent than anti-authoritarians in that sense. And so there's this maybe a more of a retreat from certain things than there is a holding of ground, or even a reclaiming of ground, if that makes sense. Because and I don't know, this is all just sort of maybe bullshit, but does this make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes those struggles are forms of semiotic violence. They're forms of sort of symbolic violence, where new idols are made in effect out of common practices, and meaning is appropriated towards the ambitions of the oppressor. So it's a field that can be very mentally traumatic. It's like a form of psychological warfare. And that, creates some big issues for society at large. And I think as the far right remains in the minority, there needs to be a broad social movement against fascism that includes centrists, because the making and remaking of meaning ought to be recreation. It ought to be fun. It ought to be, belong to, for lack of a better term, the people. And allowing it to fall into the lap of fascists is a huge L for everybody in society.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think reclaiming symbols, reclaiming meaning, is a form of expressing people power, right? Which is democratic and anti-authoritarian.
So in terms of, so crypto fascists are basically,
I will say, well, just to jump in here with a little note of individualism. I will say that people power is not always anti-authoritarian, and it's not always democratic, because people, myself included, are complete idiots. But so with a measure of perhaps ugliness there, I will say that my kind of fairy tale of popular power there needs a perhaps a little tincture of skepticism, but the cribbing a line from Captain Planet, I guess, the power is yours, right? We have the sovereignty, and we must manifest it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, and reclaiming meaning is a big part of that.
In terms of crypto fascists, it's basically like a hidden fascist or whatever, right? They're like secretly like infiltrating, sometimes even the way like an undercover cop would, into a movement to try to disseminate fascist ideas and concepts within that movement, or even get in there and co-opt them. And it seems to me that, like, okay, I've been snitch jacketed, and now there's like another thing. It's like fascist jacketed, right? Like sometimes I'll, in particular, the conversation around like population growth or so-called overpopulation, like certain things like that will like be triggers for people who have only heard about it through a certain lens or a certain context. And so it's this weird thing to be labeled a fascist by people that I think are allies who would understand that I'm talking about reproductive justice, not like killing poor people or blaming other countries or whatever for population. And then on the other side, I have actual literal fascists sending me death threats. Like there's this weird thing of like, so to be called that, for a while now, I've been like, well, I'm just done with the term altogether. But I think in your work and in other works, it's so important to continue to use the word, but to use it with clarity, and to not just throw the fascist label around or fascist jacket people, right? And so, in that, with that in mind, I'm wondering if you have any ideas around strategy for thinking about identifying crypto fascists or identifying I don't know what the question is. I mean, I have a question written down, but it's still just sort of like, I don't know if it's like my own personal defense mechanism. Like, I don't want to be called a fascist or whatever, right? But like, I think about it with the game. I think there's a game, like Werewolf or something, or there's one that's like an FBI agent where you're like trying to figure out who the FBI agent is or who the werewolf is or whatever, And it's just about like trust and perception.
Oh, sure.
And I'm wondering like what kinds of tools to have available to be able to look at somebody and look into them and actually understand what their true intentions are, versus just like blanketly, crypto fascist jacketing them or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Are there tools for doing that? Or is there like a litmus test or something like that, so that, you can use it for my own self, because I want to be trusting of other people, but then also like to get people to recognize that I'm not.
Right.
It's
obviously, it is a problem where you have people who have their own ideas of what fascism is, and who use guilt by association as well to say that such and such thing is fascist because fascists like that thing, right? Now, if you go to a conference held by a journal that is pretty much the leading journal of Holocaust denial, and you take photos with a bunch of Holocaust deniers chumming around, and afterwards show no contrition at all, that's not guilt by association, pal. That's just
totally.
That just says a lot about
yeah,
you, right?
Yeah.
Now, does it mean that you're a fascist? Does it mean that you might be like some kind of weird monarchist, or maybe like a theocrat or something like that? I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's what I mean about not mislabeling people fascist. It's kind of like it's like a it's just like it's an idiosyncratic hangup maybe, but I think people should be maybe a little bit more idiosyncratic about how they use the term. You know what I mean?
Totally.
And like there's debate about whether or not having a generic definition of fascism hurts or helps, right? Because if it helps, it's in allowing people to clarify what this is, right? What is fascism? But if it hurts, then it's a broad brush that can go outside of the lines. Because what if, again, monarchism, what if monarchism is a paleogenetic ultranationalism or something like that, or you can make the claim that it is, or something like that. So you have people kind of applying their generic definitions of fascism beyond the margins of truth, and in a defamatory sort of way. But you also have a problem with people observing that phenomenon and then using it as a shield to prevent people from criticizing them, right? So like, exactly. You just call everybody fascist, and I've been mislabeled, totally. And are you calling me a fascist? All of that sort of thing, all of that sort of stuff. God. And to get to the point that you're raising, calling people fascist, obviously it's just a good way of marginalizing their opinions that you don't agree with, when there's such better ways of doing that, like actually arguing against the opinion, right? So it's sort of like a ad hominem in a sense. Totally. So I am very, very careful with the term and its application. And I find the gray area, for example, like let's talk about Meloni in Italy. Like, is she actually a fascist? She was an MSC militant, or activist, and with the what was the fascist party. And but these days she's parliamentarian or something like that. So there's gray area. I don't know. I don't claim to, right? And I don't think people should claim to know things that they don't. And with your question, or part of your question about overpopulation, right? Like you've got on one side a sort of I think Asatru can get into this somewhat, but like this sort of racist ideal of white civilization sort of conquering and winning out, and there's sort of eco-fascist ideas of putting down, or I won't say civilization, but culture in a sense. And there's overpopulation discourse at ecological fascist narrative, which wants to curtail birth rates in the global south, and so on and so forth. Right. And then on the other side, there's like LaRoucheites who are like, there's no such thing as overpopulation, and we're gonna just like very similar to Elon Musk, right? This sort of like, God. Right. We're gonna, go to Mars, and this, that, and the other, like infinite growth is the way of the future, and they're idiots who I think I'm just like calling people jerks and idiots, and anyway, they're to be a little more refined here, their intellectual superstructure and framework is totally unsustainable, right, and authoritarian, right? And their grand narrative is based on conspiracy theory, right? So you have to contend with both kind of poles, right? And people will reference either one in order to deride somebody from a political position that they would argue against, whether they're like Maoists or whether they're liberals or whether whatever, they will attack, no, you're fascist, no, you're fascist, no, you're fascist.
Yeah.
And eh, yeah, so I don't have like a solution for that, because as I said, like, people are opportunistic oftentimes and will exploit an opportunity
Yeah.
to try to get one over on one another. And I think you see some of that with these kinds of ad hominems. So
Yeah.
my own thing is just to support integrity. Yeah. As for, uh entryism and stuff like that, you gotta just watch your back. It's kind of like identity theft. It's like it's like something
That's a good
that
analogy. Yeah.
yeah, it's just I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, cool. So one thing, um, I guess I have a question too. So, in thinking about this sort of like, well, you're a fascist, like this labeling thing, it just popped into my head this idea of like understanding that, what fascism is and super important that we want to be anti-fascist, but that the principles of anti-fascism actually like underneath all of it is really anti-authoritarianism. So I think, I mean, maybe,
No, I agree. I agree. It
yeah,
is.
and
That anti-fascism is not simply a reaction, that there is
totally.
a value structure to it.
And so I think asking, is this person in Italy a fascist or not is sort of beside the point, right? Like if she wasn't, but was something else just as horrible or horrible in a new way or whatever, right? Like, does that matter, right? Like, what are people's actions and what do we want? And so I think in terms of like the label of fascism isn't as important as people's actual actions, like understanding what fascism is as a term, but then not as a label to label certain things, right? Because
Yeah,
I think everything is always going to try to be avoiding that label regardless of what it is. And there may never be like a
right.
total fascist government again or whatever, or you know what I mean? It might just be something dissimilar or something very similar but off in a different way. We're like, is this fascism? Well, it's not, so who cares or whatever. Like, it's not like anybody's saying that either, right? But I think there's like a level of just not an obsession with the term, but like an over like a like of not fully understanding just that it is one of many things, but it is also sort of like the quintessential hierarchy or whatever, like the most abhorrent one that we've seen. Doesn't necessarily mean there isn't going to be something else that is just as abhorrent in a different way. I don't
Yeah,
know.
but and it's funny because you have reactionary anti-fascism. Like some of the early fascists ended up becoming anti-fascists because of the actions of the fascist regimes,
Right.
like George Valois, who died in the resistance, the French resistance. So there's reactionary anti-fascism of, like, say, perhaps Carlists in Spain, who opposed the Phalangists during sort of jockeying for cabinet posts under Franco, right? So there are anti-fascists on the right,
Mm.
and then there's also anti-fascism that becomes very authoritarian uh, among the left. So we can talk about, like, Stalinism, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
Stalin sucked.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
I'm gonna go out on a
Yes.
limb here and say
He killed my
Stalin
relatives.
was a
Yeah.
nightmare.
Yeah.
Um, so like, this, and you often find that Stalinists can be quite amenable to alliances with fascists, right?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's the old non-belligerence pact, but even in contemporary terms, that is relevant to, for example, Stalinists who support Putin, and so So yeah, we have to negotiate carefully what anti-fascism means and understand that conservative anti-fascism, such as that which is espoused by Putin hypocritically, also can pose a threat. Do you know what I mean? To liberty, to human equality. And so in that sense, you know, it requires a sort of a flexible approach to organizing and to perhaps living that does, like you're saying, recognizes fascism as an elitist and authoritarian political ideology among others. And so it is not enough to simply put forward anti-fascism, but you have to live it as a value structure, or as something that fits within a broader value structure or system, so that you can avoid, you know, doing what the Greek tragedy thing of becoming as bad as your enemies, or
right,
or
totally
eating your kids or something like that.
Yeah. I guess my only other question on my list that I'm feeling inspired to ask is just about the you know, the Russian influence, I don't know, on, you know, misinformation, on the rise of fascism. Like, what is within the United States or whatever, right? Like, there's, you know, my podcast is people listen to it all over, but, you know, obviously I live here, so this is my main concern, is what's going on here. And I'm curious, like, what you see in terms of, you know, social media influence or outside influence of other countries that are trying to create destabilization within other states, particularly like the United States.
It's very interesting. Some people go along with Luigi Fabri's understanding of fascism. He was an anarchist who was writing in the 1920s in exile from Italy. And he said that fascism, at least its strategy in a sense, can be described as preventive counter-revolution. So you see the revolution happening and you want to throw some water on it. And fascism is like that water, which is almost like a revolution. It mirrors the revolution. So in a sense, like a counterinsurgency ideology is something that that mirrors the insurgency, that tries to be decentralized, that tries to win hearts and minds, and so on and so forth. Counter-revolution is like a revolution, and you know, it organizes from the top down, though. So you know, and that only helps to slot fascism in a reactionary tradition that goes back to Napoleon III, that goes back to the French Directory, and shows that the opposition to revolutionary movements has always used thugs, basically, like political thugs. And that's precisely what Putin practiced in the years following the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And so Russian fascism, modern Russian fascism, always has emerged in relation to Ukraine with the support of Putin in order to both put down democracy in Ukraine and to put down democracy in Russia, to prevent the same thing from happening to him. So the presidential administration grew fairly close to fascists like Ruski Obraz, and of course Rogozin, who recently almost was blown up or in Ukraine. So they exported that model. Russia did, with the help of Rogozin. They exported this model of preventive counter-revolution. Yeah, with reactionary parties throughout Europe and the United States, like Lega is a really good example.
I don't know what that is.
Lega is one of the far right parties in Italy. And the Freedom Party in Austria, as well as other freedom parties.
So what does this look like? Is this like they're supporting them, or they're helping set them up, or
both? They gave a huge loan to Le Pen. I don't remember exactly when. It may have been like 2011, which she didn't ever pay back. So it was kind of like I don't know, collateral.
Did this happen? Is this part of like, maybe I'm misremembering this, but there was like a black nationalist group in the United States that had like some sort of funding and that was coming from Russia or something like that? Is that
Yeah,
real?
I remember that they were funded to fly somewhere and do some kind of protest, I think. Maybe it was a social media company that they were protesting. And I mean, Black Hammer, I think maybe was
That
Black
sounds
Hammer.
familiar.
Yeah, and they're a wretched, awful organization. And
Why would
a
they do
political
that?
cult. And it was a left-wing group, right? So why does Russia want to support this sort of like extreme kind of organizations in the political fringes? But because they're trying to dominate, they're trying to gain some kind of dominance in the political terrain in other countries, but also, you know, controlling the discourse is obviously a big way of doing that. So they're supporting groups that are very loud and outspoken, speak with an air of legitimacy, try actively to control narratives that will support, you know, Russian foreign policy, which, you know, especially around Ukraine. I think there's maybe a sense even that a lot of this was part of the strategy to continue the invasion of Ukraine and make it and escalate it to the level it's at right now, that they've been building towards this, and their disinformation strategy has been part of that to sort of give them a little more leeway. It failed catastrophically. And this, none of this is to downplay the kind of local nature of political right and left. So I'm not saying that Russia came along and made all of this happen.
Sure.
Right. The people in the West can have a nice scapegoat in Russia to avoid thinking through their own social crises,
totally,
and political crises. Which I'm not like sort of resting on crisis theory or anything like that as the sort of panacea, but yeah, that's just to say, like, we don't want to look inward and find out some of the big problems. And again, like the far right and far left can often be scapegoats for those problems as well. So we don't have to think about what makes these big political problems. We just have to fight the problem by, you know, throwing people in jail or whatever. And you know, you can say a bigger thing about prisons and crime in general. But I guess just to go back to Russia, and they don't exist in a vacuum, right? There are like organizations, reactionary Catholic organizations around the Vatican or elsewhere, who, for example, don't see the Pope as a true Pope and want to sort of like steer the Catholic Church against Vatican II. so there are those kinds of like weird organizations which have been somewhat successful. There's Nazi groups. There's a kind of a reactionary aristocracy that's sort of disenfranchised as a result of the massive sort of decolonization moves and the outcomes of the world wars, who are still kind of like, bumping around, and have some of them have thrown support behind Russia and obviously far right movements to try and gain back some power and legitimacy. So yeah, there are lots of like, there's big reactionary ecosystems, and what we started to see, especially like after Occupy, after like the big, Arab Spring and the big movements of 2011, we started to see those kind of clusters starting to merge together behind the model that kind of Putin had already established through this kind of preventive counter-revolution. So I think that you can't necessarily just blame Putin entirely. The model had been in existence.
Sure.
They did provide leadership, and for that reason they've become like the number one idol of international reaction, except for in Ukraine. and as a result of the Ukraine invasion, Putin has lost some support in the far right for that reason.
Interesting. Cool. So do you have any last thoughts that you want to say about the rise of the fascist threat?
I have some thoughts. Rise of fascism.
Any last bits?
I think, well, nothing that everybody else doesn't already know. I mean, I'm just kind of talking off the cuff, and I know everybody has good sense, and I'm not particularly articulate, and my thoughts aren't that interesting. So,
well, I think they are.
No,
otherwise you wouldn't be here. But yeah,
yeah. As Tacitus said, I don't know. I don't have any deep insight,
cool.
but
okay.
I have some hope. There, let's
Awesome.
leave it on a
yeah. What gives you hope?
Give me hope. My little Chihuahua dog. He's 14, still kicking around. The youth. And friends. Doing podcasts with friends.
Awesome. Cool. Well, this is going to be a 3-part series where next I'm going to interview Shane Burley, and then
God, that guy.
And then I don't know what the third episode is going to be.
What
about.
A lowlife.
The third episode will be about the sort of entryism from aspects of rewilding, or the overlap of some of the rewilding verbiage and narrative that can be confused for fascist ideology. But thank you so much.
Fun conversation
for coming on the Rewilding podcast.
Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to listening to the episode with Shane. I like to follow his different interviews and writings and stuff. He's more knowledgeable than I am, and always a great person to talk to.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guests and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Thanks so much.